Right now, all across Spain and France, vast forests are burning, and the firefighters battling those flames are discovering something genuinely chilling, that some of these fires simply cannot be put out at all. And not because there aren't enough firefighters, or enough planes, or enough water, but because the fires themselves have now crossed a kind of threshold. They have become so intense, and so fast, and so violent, that they are now, quite literally, beyond the physical limits of what any firefighting force anywhere on Earth is actually capable of controlling. Scientists have a genuinely chilling name for these new fires. They call them sixth-generation fires. And the single most terrifying thing about them is this: the very largest of these fires have now begun to generate their very own weather, their own winds, their own towering storm clouds, and even their own lightning. They are, in a very real sense, beginning to behave almost like living things, and they are the face of a new and a deeply dangerous era of fire. Before we go any further, if this is exactly the kind of story you came here for, take just 1 second to subscribe. A lot of folks watch these all the way to the end and simply forget to, and it genuinely helps this channel keep making them. Alright, let's begin. To really understand what is changing here, let's start with the absolute basics of what a fire actually needs in order to burn. Because any fire, anywhere on Earth, requires just 3 simple things. It needs fuel to burn, it needs oxygen from the surrounding air, and it needs some source of heat to get it started in the first place. And then, how a wildfire actually goes on to behave, how fast it spreads, how hot it burns, and which direction it chooses to move, really comes down to 3 main factors: the fuel, the weather, and the shape of the land itself. Change any one of those 3 things, and you fundamentally change the fire. And here, right here, is the truly crucial point of this entire video. A warming climate is now changing all 3 of them, all at once, and every single one of them for the worse. So let's begin with the fuel, which is really just another word for the vegetation. The trees, and the brush, and the grass, and all the dead leaves and fallen branches lying on the forest floor. And the single most important thing about all of that fuel, when it comes to the question of fire, is quite simply how dry it happens to be. Because dry fuel ignites incredibly easily and then burns ferociously, while moist, damp fuel stubbornly resists catching light at all. And this is precisely where a warming climate does its most fundamental and its most dangerous damage, because as the temperatures steadily rise, the hotter air begins to act rather like a giant sponge, actively pulling the moisture straight out of the soil and even out of the living plants themselves. Scientists have a name for this steady process. They call it increasing fuel aridity, which is simply the slow drying out of the entire landscape. And I'm genuinely curious as we go, have wildfires or wildfire smoke ever affected the area where you live? Let me know down in the comments and where you're watching from. I read them all, and honestly, they often decide what I dig into next. And the actual numbers on this are genuinely stark. Because one major scientific study found that human-caused climate change was responsible for well over half of the entire increase in fuel dryness right across the western United States since the 1970s. And, even more strikingly, that this one drying effect alone had effectively doubled the total area burned by forest fires there since the 1980s. So, to put it just as simply as it can possibly be put, a warmer world is a drier world, and a drier world is inevitably a far more flammable one. But it is not merely that the fuel itself is now drier than before, because 2 other crucial things are also happening at the very same time. The first is that the fire season itself is steadily getting longer, because as the warming brings us earlier and earlier springs, and later autumn rains, the total window of time during which fires are able to start and spread has been stretching out longer and longer, in some places by entire months. And the second thing is that, in a genuinely cruel irony, there is now very often more fuel lying around than ever before in history. Because for the better part of the last century, our instinct, whenever a wildfire appeared, was simply to rush out and put every single one of them out, as quickly as we possibly could. But it turns out that a great many of the world's landscapes actually genuinely need small, regular, gentle fires to periodically clear out all the built-up dead wood and undergrowth. And so, by so successfully suppressing all of those small fires over so many decades, we quietly allowed all of that dead material to build up year after year after year into truly vast stockpiles of dry tinder. Scientists actually call this the fire paradox, the deeply counterintuitive fact that the more successfully we manage to put out all the small fires, the more and more fuel silently accumulates on the landscape, and therefore the more utterly catastrophic the big one inevitably becomes when it finally and unavoidably does ignite. And across parts of Europe in particular, this whole problem has been made considerably worse still by what's known as rural abandonment. Because as more and more people steadily leave the countryside behind, moving away to live in the big cities, the land that was once carefully grazed by animals and tended by farmers instead grows wild and thick and dangerously overgrown with fuel. And it isn't only the fuel that a warming climate is worsening, it's the weather too, and above all, the wind. Because wind is a wildfire's single greatest ally. It feeds the flames a constant fresh supply of oxygen, it bends the fire forward and drives it across the land at terrifying speed, and it hurls burning embers far out ahead of the front. A fire that might otherwise be manageable can, in a strong wind, become an unstoppable wall of flame within minutes, as the world saw in the horrific wind-driven fire that destroyed the town of Lahaina in Hawaii in a matter of hours. And then there is the third factor, the shape of the land itself. Because fire, crucially, races much faster uphill than down, the flames reach forward and preheat the slope above them, so a fire climbing a steep hillside can accelerate ferociously. Put a dry fuel load, a fierce wind, and steep terrain together, and you have assembled the perfect recipe for catastrophe. So now, just picture the situation we have ended up creating. You have a landscape that is drier than before, and more choked with accumulated fuel than before, and flammable for more months of the year than ever before. And the direct result of all of that is a fundamentally and a frighteningly new kind of fire. In fact, fire scientists have now actually begun to formally classify wildfires into distinct generations, based entirely on how they behave, and each successive generation has proven to be more extreme and more dangerous than the very last one before it. The earliest generations were essentially the fires of the past, fires that simply spread steadily across continuous fuel, and then fires that learned to move faster, and then intense fires that began throwing off brand new spot fires ahead of themselves. Then came the generation of fires that started invading the very edges of our towns and our cities, instantly transforming a simple forest fire into a full-blown civil emergency, and then fires that would break out in many different places all at once, completely overwhelming absolutely everyone trying to fight them. And now, at the very far, extreme end of this steadily escalating scale, we have finally arrived at what the scientists have come to call the sixth generation. Quick one before we continue. If someone in your family or a friend would find this genuinely fascinating, please do send it their way. That word of mouth is honestly how a channel like this one grows. And if it's been worth your time so far, a quick like really does help the next person find it too. And the single defining feature of these new sixth generation fires is, quite simply, they're raw and staggering and almost unimaginable energy, an intensity so overwhelmingly great that human beings can no longer actually fight them directly at all. Because it turns out that there is a genuine, hard, physical limit to firefighting itself. Once a fire is releasing more than about 10 megawatts of energy for every single meter of its advancing front, then no amount of water at all, and no fleet of aircraft and no crew of brave firefighters can possibly stop it. Beyond that one critical threshold, any direct attack on the fire is simply and completely futile, and the only thing that anyone can do anymore is to try to get people safely out of the way of it. And just to give you some real sense of the scale involved here, one of the very first of these fires ever recognized, which struck Portugal back in 2017, was actually measured releasing something like 14 times that critical limit. A fire like that, you see, is simply not something that you fight. It is something that you flee. But the truly astonishing And the genuinely, deeply frightening hallmark of these great megafires is really this: they eventually become powerful enough to create their very own weather. And let me explain exactly how that happens. Because when a fire grows big enough and hot enough, it begins to send an absolutely colossal column of superheated air roaring straight upward, high into the sky above it. And as all of that air rises and then slowly cools at altitude, the moisture within it, moisture released from all the burning vegetation below, can begin to condense into a cloud. But this, it turns out, is very much no ordinary cloud at all. It is a vast, towering, violently churning thundercloud, one born entirely and solely from the raw energy of the fire itself. Scientists call this remarkable thing a pyrocumulonimbus cloud, and it is, in effect, quite literally a fire-breathing storm. And once a fire has actually managed to create one of these monstrous storm clouds above itself, then absolutely everything changes. Because that cloud can now begin to generate its own violent and erratic and utterly unpredictable winds. Powerful winds that come screaming back down toward the fire below, whipping the flames into an absolute frenzy and driving the whole fire off in sudden and deadly and entirely new directions that simply no one on the ground can possibly forecast in advance. That cloud can also generate its very own lightning, hurling bolts of it down miles and miles ahead of the main fire front, and instantly igniting brand new blazes far, far beyond it. And in the very worst cases of all, the sheer raw violence of all that rising heat can actually spin up an entire tornado made purely of fire, a so-called firenado, a genuine whirling, spinning column of pure flame. The fire, in other words, is at this point no longer merely responding to the weather and the world around it. It has, instead, effectively become its very own self-contained weather system, a self-sustaining and a self-propelling engine of destruction, one that actively generates the exact conditions that it needs in order to keep on growing. And that, right there, is precisely why these fires become so utterly impossible to control, and so completely impossible to predict. And there is just one more devastating way in which these great fires manage to defeat us, and that is with embers. Because a fierce enough fire will hurl burning embers, tiny flaming firebrands, high up into its own churning winds, and can then rain them all back down as far as several miles ahead of the main flames. And this is exactly how these fires manage to leap clean across highways, and across rivers, and across fire breaks, across the very barriers that we deliberately build in order to try to stop them, igniting fresh new fires far out in front of themselves, and, most terrifyingly of all, encircling the very towns and the very people who are desperately trying to escape. And none of this, I want to stress, is remotely theoretical. It is happening, right now, all over the world, and with steadily increasing frequency. That catastrophic fire in Portugal back in 2017 trapped and killed dozens of people, many of them caught and overrun inside their own cars as they tried desperately to flee. Australia's so-called Black Summer, across 2019 and 2020, burned an area of land very nearly the size of an entire country and spawned dozens upon dozens of those fire-generated thunderstorms. Canada then endured, by far, its very worst fire season in all of recorded history in 2023, sending truly vast plumes of thick smoke drifting right across the Atlantic Ocean, and turning the skies high above distant American cities an eerie, apocalyptic orange. In California, the entire town of Paradise was very nearly wiped completely off the map in a matter of just a few short hours back in 2018. And now, this very summer, the fires burning across Spain and France have already driven well over 100,000 people from their homes. From the Mediterranean, to the Americas, to Australia, the very same frightening new kind of fire is now emerging everywhere. And part of the reason these fires have become quite so deadly to people is that more and more of us are now living directly in their path. Scientists call it the wildland-urban interface, the rapidly growing zone where our towns and our neighborhoods and our homes push right up against wild and highly flammable forest and brush. As populations grow, and as people increasingly seek out homes surrounded by natural beauty, we have steadily built further and further into exactly the places most likely to burn. And so, when one of these great fires finally comes roaring through, it now finds not just empty wilderness in its way, but houses, and roads clogged with fleeing cars, and thousands upon thousands of people who suddenly have to escape all at once, and often with terrifyingly little warning. We have, in a very real sense, been building our lives directly into the firing line. And here is something genuinely crucial that very often gets almost entirely overlooked, because the single deadliest thing about a wildfire is, very frequently, not actually the flames at all. It is the smoke. Because wildfire smoke is absolutely full of tiny microscopic particles that lodge themselves deep inside the lungs, and it can travel for many thousands of miles on the wind, quietly poisoning the air for many millions of people who may well live nowhere near the actual fire itself. In fact, by some estimates, the air pollution from wildfire smoke contributes to hundreds of thousands of premature deaths right around the world, every single year, very likely, far, far more than the fires themselves ever manage to kill directly through their flames. The fire, in other words, may well be intensely local, but its smoke has quietly become a genuinely global public health catastrophe. And there is one final, and a genuinely deeply troubling, twist to this entire story, and it takes the form of a vicious circle. Because whenever a great forest burns, it releases all of the carbon that those trees had so patiently stored up over decades or even over whole centuries, straight back out into the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. And that carbon, of course, then goes on to add directly to the very same global warming that is drying out those forests and making the fires so much worse in the first place. So more warming leads directly to more fire, and then more fire leads directly to yet more warming. It is a genuine feedback loop, and it is one that many scientists now quietly worry could, in certain vulnerable regions of the world, begin to dangerously feed upon itself. So let me end, as I always try to, with genuine honesty and with real balance. First, and this is genuinely important, fire itself is not in any way the enemy here, and it is very far from being anything new. Because fire is a completely natural, and even an absolutely essential, part of a great many of the world's ecosystems. For many millions of years, landscapes all over the planet have burned, and a huge number of plants and animals have actually evolved to depend upon it. Some seeds, quite remarkably, will only ever sprout at all after a fire has passed over them. So the goal here is not, and it never possibly could be, some impossible world with no fire in it at all. The real problem, instead, is the fundamentally changing character of fire, this dangerous and unnatural shift toward these monstrous and uncontrollable megafires. Second, and equally crucially, climate change is genuinely not the only culprit at work in any of this. It is, as the scientists themselves carefully put it, a threat multiplier. Because the vast majority of all wildfires are still, in actual fact, started by us, by human beings, whether through simple accidents or through downed power lines, or sometimes through deliberate arson. And decades of accumulated fuel build up from our own well-meaning firefighting, along with our collective choice to keep building more and more of our homes right up against wild. And fire-prone land have all combined to make us far, far more vulnerable than we ever needed to be. Climate change, in other words, may load the dice heavily toward disaster, but it is very much still human decisions that actually deal the cards. And third, and this part is genuinely and importantly hopeful, this is simply not by any means a hopeless situation, because we actually already know exactly what we need to do about it. And the experts are now increasingly and emphatically clear that the real answer is not simply to go out and buy ourselves ever more fire trucks and water-bombing aircraft, because, as we have already seen, against a true sixth-generation fire, those things sadly do not work anyway. The real answer, instead, lies entirely in acting long before the fire ever even starts, in deliberately and carefully managing our landscapes through controlled and prescribed burns that safely clear out all of that dangerous built-up fuel, and humbly learning from the indigenous peoples who successfully tended these very lands with fire for many thousands of years. in building our homes to be far more genuinely fire resistant, and in simply being a great deal wiser about exactly where and how we choose to build them in the first place. But the core message of those fires now burning right across southern Europe is a genuinely serious one, and it is very much worth all of us hearing, and hearing clearly. Because we have now, quite simply, entered a new age of fire. The great blazes of the past, the very ones that our firefighting systems and our maps and all of our deepest instincts were every one of them originally built around, are now steadily giving way to something else entirely, something bigger and faster, and something fundamentally and frighteningly wilder. Fires that actually make their own weather. Fires that genuinely cannot be fought at all, but only ever fled from. And as the whole world continues, relentlessly, to warm, and as the great forests continue, steadily to dry, these are simply the fires that more and more of us, on every single inhabited continent, are now going to have to slowly learn how to live alongside. So the very next time that you happen to see the news filled with those terrible, towering walls of orange flame, and those vast skies utterly choked with thick brown smoke, I want you to understand that you are very likely no longer looking at merely a somewhat bigger version of an old and a familiar kind of disaster. You may, in fact, be looking directly at something genuinely and profoundly new, a fire that has now crossed a threshold into an entire category of raw violence that the human race, frankly, has very little real experience in ever confronting. Because we have, for the whole of our long history as a species, always tended to think of ourselves as the true masters of fire, as the one clever animal that first tamed it and cooked its food with it and then went on to build an entire towering civilization upon it. But out there, right now, in the steadily drying forests of a rapidly warming world, fire is quietly beginning to slip free of that ancient leash of ours, and learning, at last, how to truly live with it once again, not to arrogantly conquer it, but instead to genuinely respect it, and to carefully prepare for it, and to wisely give it room, may very well turn out to be one of the single defining challenges of the entire century that now lies ahead of us. The age of the megafire, it seems, has now well and truly arrived, and that dark smoke, gathering there on the far horizon, is very clearly telling us that we had all better learn its hard lessons, and we had better learn them quickly. It,